How many times have Magic players truly broken a format? Tournaments will always have metagames, the game above the game, as a means to define what they expect the field to be and subsequently how to attack it. Ole might have not broken a format with his Spiders deck, but he certainly identified a metagame weakness he could exploit. Elves was clearly the best deck at Pro Tour Berlin and everyone knew it, but a deck being so powerful it would later receive bans doesn't necessarily mean the format was broken, maybe just that the deck was and it needed an adjustment in power level. In gaming, but especially in card games, broken is a loaded word, one that comes with all sorts of assumptions and critiques of format or design, but one that is often overused because while sometimes things are out of line, they're not always over it. Broken is a word often taken up as a rally cry to complain about the state of a card game, but isn't always used appropriately. To break something, the novelty and the power level need to be at near maximum heights. It isn't enough for something to be very powerful, even if that something would end up being banned in the future. Probably the best example of a classically broken Magic card is Tolarian Academy, the poster child for an overbearing combo metagame that swept through the formats it was legal in as a 4-of for the short time it was legal. Granted, like the sins of Lin Civi later, Academy also caused issues because of how it played under the old Legend rule, but even under current rule sets, Academy being legal in just about any modern day Magic format would be metagame warpingly problematic. Suffice to say, the bar is high for an individual card to be broken, so if you're gonna break a whole format, just how much of a novel, overbearing edge do you need to have? Magic is a storied and complex enough game that I'm sure this isn't the only time it's happened in the game's history, but this video is about a Pro Tour that is one of the most unique things that was ever played. So much so that the format for the event was only ever played at the Pro Tour level once. In 2007 at Pro Tour San Diego, two longtime friends are playing together on tour for the first time ever, and they are about to live the competitive Magic dream and then some. Not only are they going to win this event, they're going to make history in the process. They're going to break a Pro Tour record for winning a Pro Tour top card in the shortest number of turns ever, setting a record that can likely never be beaten. They're going to take this format, analyze the available cards and strategies, and win in a way that no one else even thought of. They're going to break this format over their knee and ride off into the sunset as Pro Tour champions. This is the story of how for one tournament, two Nobodies became an unbeatable duo at the highest level of the game. This is the story of Chris Lachmann and Jacob van Lunen, better known as the Sliver Kids. Now in Magic, Slivers are a long-standing creature type that's supremely popular among players of all levels. First appearing in 1997 in the set Tempest, Slivers were unique, almost alien-looking creatures. Mechanically, Slivers were a hive mind that got benefits from the abilities of your other Slivers. Muscle Sliver, for example, would give all of your Slivers +1/+1, making your entire board stronger so long as it has the same type. Wing Sliver would give them all flying, and if you had both, you'd get to reap the cumulative benefits of all your Slivers as they came together. Individually, the cards weren't too impressive, but as a single acting entity, they could snowball into powerful boards. For competitive players, some of the Slivers were just well costed, and you could build decks that synergized with the type and gave you an efficient threat base to work from, whereas the more casual player base enjoyed the process of building a board state that grew exponentially with your collection of creatures. How Slivers play into this Pro Tour is both weird and fascinating, but before we get there, we need to establish the format that Jacob and Chris were playing. Like I said, it's the most unique format to ever be played at the Pro Tour level, and they only did it once. San Diego 2007 is a limited Pro Tour, meaning instead of constructing decks from a specific group of cards or sets, the players instead are opening sealed packs of whatever sets the event is using, and then drafting their deck every few rounds. While this isn't the only way to play a limited event, different forms of drafting are the most common form of limited play at the Pro Tour level. Drafting is a hugely skill-testing endeavor, where your understanding of the depth of the card pool, Magic fundamentals, and overall read on what strategies from a set are too good to ignore all come together. Even though the distribution of available cards is subject to significantly more variance than constructed, you're still rewarded for understanding the same general principles that apply to metagaming there. If you understand what's good and others don't, you can find an edge by reading signals well in draft, moving into less popular archetypes, and of course, just playing well. In constructed, metagaming might look something like understanding what the popular cards or decks might be, and then bringing things to counter or offset them. In limited, this idea mostly comes from the understanding that colors might be strong or popular, and this typically hinges on what commons are good. Sure, a good rare in draft might be so powerful that you're willing to warp your deck a little to play it because the upside is so high. Draft strategies tend to get built around the strength of individual commons because those are the cards you're likely to see most frequently. After all, players are drafting essentially out of random booster packs, and those have more commons in them than rares or mythics. San Diego's limited block of choice is in my opinion one of the best blocks for limited of all time. I liked all three of the different iterations that the format offered across its lifespan, but the nature of the sets also gave them a unique twist. The block in question is Time Spiral Block, a set full of nostalgia, references to older parts of Magic's history, including familiar faces and creature types, including including Slivers. While the earlier limited Pro Tour in the season in Geneva featured only the first two sets, Time Spiral and Planet Chaos, San Diego showed off the full block worth of sets. This is especially interesting because each set in the block contained a small gimmick. Time Spiral had a bonus sheet of 121 cards from the past that were all legal to be played in draft if you opened them, making it about 25% bigger than a comparative big set. For example, Ravnica, the first set of the previous block, had a similar number of cards as Time Spiral but was missing the bonus sheet. Planet Chaos featured color shifted cards, giving effects like Giant Growth and Wrath of God to new colors for the first time ever. Future Sight though probably had the most interesting gimmick of them all. In this small set, a number of cards were special future shifted cards, featuring a special frame and effects from the future of Magic, which meant mostly a number of one-off and experimental card designs, although some of them did creep into constructed play eventually. All of this combined into a pretty well-balanced limited format that had a bunch of additional cards in one of its sets and a host of unique cards in the others for players to explore. For the most part, none of the future shifted cards made a huge impact in draft though, as the maxim of good cards being good still held strong and the special Future Sight cards were by and large very niche. So what's so special? Sure, Time Spiral block is an interesting collection of cards, with a slightly bigger card pool than usual, but it's still a limited Pro Tour, right? Well, yeah, but this is a special one. So special, in fact, that this format only ever had this single Pro Tour to ever feature it. While the format is draft, it's got a twist to it. Like many Pro Tours of the past, this is a team Pro Tour, meaning instead of being an individual competitor, you are on a team. Typically, teams at the Team Pro Tour are made up of 3 players, and there have been some absolutely legendary teams to have Pro Tour success. This San Diego is different though. The format is Time Spiral 2-headed giant booster draft, meaning that instead of a team of 3, you have one of just 2. And as the name suggests, you're playing together. 2 players with 2 different decks working to defeat another team of 2, all while sharing a life total and all the game's phases taking place simultaneously. This led to quite a few important differences. Number 1, each player's cards are independent, but you are allowed to see your teammates' cards and communicate with your teammates during a game. Number 2, generally players are treated as individual players despite being one team. So a card like Grey Merchant of Asphodel, for example, is doubly as effective as 2-headed giant versus 1v1, kind of like how it would work in Commander. Number 3, a team of 2 players has a combined 30 life instead of the usual 20. Number 4, when drafting, each team of players takes 2 cards out of the pack instead of the usual 1, but each player still has the same number of packs as they would in an 8-person draft. Number 5, because of the format of this specific event, the last 2 rounds of Swiss were actually played on Championship Sunday before a cut to top 4 instead of top 8. And finally, all games at this Pro Tour are best of 1, including the semi-finals and finals, so you better be confident in your draft strategy. This somewhat casual multiplayer format had been picking up speed among the community, and WotC had decided to just run it for the Pro Tour, and weirdly the pros seemed excited about it. Not only was the draft format itself interesting, but 2-headed giant was now being stress tested by the game's best players. Besides, the amount of high-powered duos that were attending this event was kind of incredible. Likely this was helped by the opening of the Magic Hall of Fame in 2005, which back then gave Hall of Famers automatic invites to each Pro Tour. There were so many powerhouse team-ups at this event that it would have made much of the machine blush. Now, while strategically, 2-headed giant offered a few interesting differences from 1v1 Time Spiral drafts, it did seem like good teamwork and good drafting were still going to be the keys to success at this event. There weren't that many cards in the format that could really abuse some of the multiplayer aspects of it, and the block overall had been tried and tested across a number of PT level events at this point. The 30 life aspect made some of the more controlling strategies seem a bit more attractive as you had a bigger life buffer to work with, but overall you were still drafting mostly the same way as 1v1, just for a team of 2 players. One of the more interesting thoughts at the Pro Tour was this idea that maybe you should have one player drafting creatures and the other drafting spells to kind of create a 2-headed tempo giant, where one player is making sure threats stay consistent and the other is controlling the board and countering key spells, kind of like if you took a Delver deck and split the 2 different halves across 2 separate players. What no one else found but Lachmann and Van Lunen though was this novel Sliver strategy. Slivers were a fringe draft archetype in Time Spiral block, but were mostly an added bonus to your otherwise solid cards. For example, Sinew Sliver was a 2/2 for 2 that made your other random slivers a bit bigger, while Gemhide Sliver was a decent common mana dog that sometimes let you collect big amounts of mana if you had a couple of extra slivers lying around your board. Overall, the sliver cards that already saw play were generally just good cards as printed, but sometimes you would have a few of them that get to cash in on the snowballing bonuses they offered you for being loyal to their creature type. For the most part though, you couldn't really just force a dedicated sliver deck, at least a good one. There just wasn't enough on offer to justify taking weaker cards over the other staples in your colors, especially since the Time Spiral slivers had the old sliver templating that meant that they also affected your opponent's slivers. This fact was part of the reason Lachmann and Van Lunen's draft strategy was so brilliant. If the other players were drafting Slivers away from them but didn't know how to build those decks, they just got to take regular good cards and draft. The reward though, unbridled power and the complete decimation of their opponents, all because of one little common sliver they've printed in Future Sight. A preprint, if you will, of cards to potentially come in Magic's future. Long before Scars of Mirrodin or Phyrexia All Be One, Mark Rosewater himself planted a flag in the ground that this mechanic would return one day. And lo and behold, that little signpost to the future created a green 1-drop sliver that brought a Pro Tour to its knees at the hands of the Sliver kids. The secret sauce was there all along in the last pack of the draft. Virulent Sliver. The precursor to Infect and particularly Toxic, Virulent Sliver has Poisonous One, giving a player it deals combat damage to a single poison counter. Actually, it's a Sliver, so it gives all Slivers Poisonous One, but like all the Slivers, it also counts itself. On the surface, this doesn't seem all that threatening. You need 10 total poison counters in order to kill your opponent with poison, and there were just not enough cards that could do this for it to be threatening. Remember, this is well before Infect and Pump Spells built a deck with real poison threat to it. In fact, at the time of Virulent Sliver's original printing in Time Spiral, the game only had 8 other cards that could even poison you, including Snake Cult Initiation, another Future Sight take on the poisonous mechanic in the form of an aura, and the old Swamp Mosquito from Alliances, which is actually on the bonus sheet for Time Spiral, funnily enough. But these cards are all pretty bad. Poison was mostly a silly alternate win condition that at this point didn't have any serious competitive implications. Before this Pro Tour, the number of players that lost a game due to poison counters was probably 0, but that changed dramatically thanks to the Sliver Kids draft strategy. So what was the plan? Obviously, if you draft enough aggressive Slivers, deploy a Virulent, and attack, you can pretty quickly cut down life totals and poison your opponents to death. This is made even more effective due to the unique nature of the format, as not only are the life totals themselves larger, which poison effectively ignores, but 2 different players being able to deploy Slivers made assembling a critical mass of them that much easier. The templating of Slivers at the time also made them so much more effective in Two-Headed Giant. Typically, if you had an effect like Glorious Anthem on your board in a game of Two-Headed Giant, it would only make your creatures bigger, but not your teammates. Slivers naturally hit all Slivers at the table though, which means you didn't even have to play a Virulent Sliver yourself to start swinging in for poison. Your teammate could do it for you. Two-Headed Sliver was also an all-star for this draft strategy, effectively giving all the Slivers menace and made blocking basically impossible for your opponents who would quickly get poisoned to death. Add on to this that if you had multiple of these Slivers in play, all the instances of Poisonous One would stack, meaning that you would deal poison damage very, very quickly. Even without the Poison Sliver though, Lachmann and Lunen were willing to build other Sliver decks and rode the creature type's inbuilt synergy to an impressive win streak on day 1, going undefeated to start their event. That's right, 2 Pro Tour qualifier winners who have never played at the Pro Tour before were ahead of a stacked field of the game's legends by using Slivers. On day 1 especially, their strategy was completely brilliant because no one else wanted these cards, because no one else thought you could play Slivers in this format. So the duo would even pass on the Sliver cards they wanted early, instead taking regular strong draft staples, only to still get the Sliver cards they passed on when they wheeled back around. If you know anything about basic draft strategy, you'll understand how impressive it is to craft a draft strategy where you continually get cards you want wheeled back to you. That is extremely rare. But the question had to be asked, is this strategy actually good once people know about it? Because after day 1, everyone knew about it. In fact, having a perfect day 1 record with an unorthodox draft strategy might arguably be detrimental in some ways, because once the Sliver is out of the proverbial booster pack, it becomes harder to hit your strategy. Once people start respecting your key Slivers, they can either hate draft them or simply start utilizing the strategy themselves. This whole scenario though was somehow made even more ridiculous. The duo was so successful that the official Pro Tour coverage covered their draft strategy on YouTube as part of the new online coverage presence that WotC had been trying. Remember, this event is more than 15 years ago. The coverage from this event is some of the oldest on the official Magic the Gathering YouTube channel, and you're doing great at this event, and Randy Bueller and Brian David Marshall are just leaking your draft strategy for everyone with an internet connection to hear about. Granted, even without that, there's no way this would have gone unnoticed by players playing at this tournament. So no matter what, Lachmann and Van Lunen knew they were going to be up against people that eventually knew their strategy and could choose to try and take key pieces away from them. And it mattered. They were actually changing the metagame at the Pro Tour as they were playing it. Established pros like Japan's Kenji Samura started using the same draft strategy as more and more of the competitors caught wind of it, and the Sliver kids ended up having to draft more normal looking decks instead. Granted, that didn't seem to slow them down. Even though they did start finally losing some rounds, they ended up squeezing into 4th place overall by the time the cut to top 4 was made, demonstrating more than enough mastery of the format in the process. But surely at this point, after 14 rounds of competition, with their strategy uncovered, this is where the run would stop for the 2 PTQ winners. The pair of Pro Tour hopefuls who had already shaken up so much of the event already. They were about to draft for one last time at this event, and now there are no illusions. Everyone knows what you're up to. To make matters even more absurd though, the team on their right, aka the team responsible for feeding them most of their draft picks for the final draft of the Pro Tour, were none other than Magic legend Eugene Harvey and John Fiorello, who had specifically stated to the coverage they were more than willing to hate draft picks away from the Sliver kids if they had the opportunity. You are not only entering an environment where everyone now fully knows your strategy, but the team in the most critical position of your last draft is willing and able to disrupt you. The absurdity of this moment though is that Harvey and Fiorello had an even bigger part to play in the story of the Sliver kids, as they were all part of the same testing team that was trying to figure out the format before the event, and in testing got poisoned by Lachmann and Van Lunen. Reportedly, they were so upset that these PTQ players would use a silly, non-viable strategy to beat them during the tournament practice sessions that they only had a limited number of. Effectively, they said, "Why are you doing this? That'll never work at the Pro Tour." Well, it turns out they and everyone else are wrong. Just think for a second about the spot Lachmann and Van Lunen are in. They're about to do their last draft of the event and potentially walk away from the first Pro Tour they've ever competed in, $50,000 richer, and anointed as champions of the most unique format that's ever graced the scene. If they win, they'll do it in a way that no one expected, planned for, or predicted, even though competitors at the event tested with them and lost to their exact Sliver strategy in playtesting. The Sliver kids knew they had an edge, believed in their read, and studied the once-in-a-lifetime format and all its eccentricities more than anyone else in the star-studded field. So with all that known, with everything out there and on the line, what else do the Sliver kids see when they open their first pack and take their first 2 picks of the final draft?
We've been talking about them since round 3 when they poisoned Eugene Harvey and John Fiorello to death. Something they interestingly did in playtesting prior to the event also. They also poisoned Eugene Harvey to death back in New Jersey.
6 Sliver decks out of 7 draft pods so far. I talked to them before the draft. They said they'll draft Slivers if it's there, but they don't want to force it. There's Telekinetic.
Telekinetic and Screech, they're going to take
Rift Bolt. Oh, Bone Splitter. They have not had a Bone Splitter all weekend. 0 mites, 0 Bone Splitters the entire weekend. They finally busted some real Slivers instead of trying to make do with all the garbage you want. Do you really take Slivers?
In what felt like an instant, Lachmann and Van Lunen were crowned champions of Pro Tour San Diego. Due to the unique best-of-1 format and the speed at which their Sliver deck could win, their entire top 4 run took a total of 9 turns in what will presumably always be the fastest Pro Tour top cut ever, poisoning their opponents in the semifinals with their signature Virulent Sliver before beating down the old-fashioned way with 2-headed and Bone Splitter Sliver in the final. The Sliver kids were vindicated for studying and valuing the cards that no one else wanted, and they were rewarded by a record-breaking ride to their first Pro Tour win ever. They had broken the format, and they likely knew it all along, but now everyone else finally got to see that they were right. If you enjoyed this video, click the thumbs up button until it glows and fills you with dopamine. It helps the channel out a lot. Subscribe if you're new here so you don't miss more videos like this one. And whatever YouTube is showing you right now is what it thinks you'll like from my channel, so you should watch that too if it looks interesting to you. Thanks for watching.